Welcome back to a second exciting installment of When Does Age of Empires 2 Take Place? The series where we look through in-game technologies and histories to determine the approximate time frame that the game is meant to represent. For the full introduction and the look at the generic tech tree, be sure to check out Part 1. Today, as promised, we're looking at the in-game civilization's unique units and unique techs. For those watching who are unfamiliar with these, wow, I'm kind of surprised you're watching a video about Age of Empires without being familiar with the game. But hey, that's actually really cool. I'm really glad you find this interesting enough to watch, and I hope you enjoy it. Anyway, at time of release of this video, there are 43 playable civilizations in-game, and each of them has at least one unique unit and two unique technologies. The unique unit and first unique tech become available in the Castle Age, and the other becomes available in the Imperial Age. Before getting into the video, everything I'm presenting is a product of my own personal research, analysis, and impressions. I'm neither a medieval historian nor an insider on the development of Age of Empires, so if I whiff on anything in this video, let me know what I'm missing in the comments, but go easy on me. But because the first unique techs and the unique units become available upon reaching the Castle Age, the historical onset of these techs and units in reality should provide us with an additional data point for when Age of Empires 2's Castle Age was meant to take place. Thereafter, the onset of the second unique tech should provide us a data point for the onset of the Imperial Age. Because of the diversity in each civilization's unique units and techs, we can also start to get an idea of which civilizations are relatively early and late to the field. It's worth noting, however, that this is just 3 or so data points per civilization, and a more in-depth look at the history of each civilization is forthcoming in a future video. We'll begin by presenting the new and improved plotting system brought courtesy of Matplotlib and Google Colab. Yeah, I know Python, no big deal. Anyway, here is the full plot of unique units and techs. I know, it's a very busy graphic, a lot to take in, and that's why we can parse it out piece by piece. First, let's just consider the unique units. To start, I set up this timeline where the early outliers are condensed on the left-hand side. Most of the timeline is the 2 millennia of the Common Era, from 1 to 2000, where we expect the timeline of AoE 2 to fall within. However, a few of these unique techs and units are going to fall much earlier than that, and I've broken down these outliers into pre-classical, i.e. more than 1 millennium BCE, and pre-medieval, i.e. the first millennium BCE. No unique unit falls into the pre-classical era, though the boundaries are a little hazy, but many of the North African, Middle Eastern, and South Asian civs in particular have pre-medieval unique units. The Berbers have the camel archer. The birth of camel-based archery, though mostly within Persia, Arabia, and the Levant, traces back to about 500 BCE. The war elephants of Persia were first attested to in European sources during the campaigns of Alexander the Great in the 3rd century BCE. Transitioning to the Indian subcontinent, the Bengalis have the Ratha chariot riders, the use of which were attested to in early Vedic texts. The Dravidians have the Urumi swordsmen. Fascinatingly, Urumi are a sort of sword-whip hybrid, where the blade itself is a flimsy band of metal that allows skilled users to combine the sharpness of a blade with the flexibility of a whip. This dates back to the first couple centuries BCE. The Gurjaras have the chakram throwers. Chakrams are sharp throwing weapons that date back to the 5th century BCE. This leaves a few outliers in Europe and Asia whose unique units otherwise stick within the Common Era. The first is the Celts' Woad Raider. This unit refers to the Romans' account of warriors on the island of Britain painting themselves in blue war paint made out of the woad plant. This, of course, takes place 1,000 years before medieval Celtic history. Particularly jarring is the identification within the game manual of William Wallace as a, quote, renowned woad raider. Unlike the Mel Gibson movie would have you believe, by the time of William Wallace, woad was no longer being used as a blue war paint. Second is the Vikings' longbow. These have been archaeologically demonstrated to date back to at least the 4th century BCE, making them a particularly old European unique unit. Over in East Asia, the Koreans' war wagon dates back to the 2nd century BCE, at least to use in a battle between the Han Chinese and nomadic Xiongnu within modern Mongolia. Just over the threshold of the Common Era are a couple unique units from the original Age of Kings release, the Byzantines' cataphracts in the Chinese Chukonu. Back when the Roman Empire was still one combined piece, Emperor Hadrian began creating units of fully armored cavalry, the practice of which would continue through the fall of the West and into the existence of what we'd call the Byzantine Empire. The Chukonu, or the invention of a multi-bolt firing crossbow, is credited to Zhuge Liang, a statesman and strategist who lived in the 3rd century China. A couple unique units pushed the game's boundaries into the future relative to the rest of the field. The Malian's Gabetto warrior dates as late as 1645, when the king of Dahomey began recruiting Gabettos, or huntresses, into his military. Similarly, for the Vietnamese rattan archers, or archers who use bows made out of rattan wood, I did not find much evidence linking them to Vietnamese history. The best I could find were sources saying that bows in Japan were being constructed using rattan starting around 1700. This leads to a couple of units hovering by 1999, like when Bill Clinton was president. Astute observers may also notice that this is the year that Age of Empires 2 was first released. Accordingly, every tech or unique unit that is too broad, isn't really grounded in verifiable history, or just is all around kind of BS, will be considered as a creation of 1999. And I know that not every Civ came with the original game, but I wasn't keeping track of that, relax. So, the first among the unique units is the Burmese Arambai. Frankly, I struggled to find verifiable information about Arambai at all. Next is the Dravidians Thirasadai. According to the Age of Empires wiki on the unit, it appears to be based on a Wikipedia article that has since been edited to remove all mention of the term Thirasadai, after a Reddit user demonstrated that none of the cited sources even mentioned the term. Now that we have this lovely graphic, we can finally see which unique units are historically furthest apart. The question I had originally posed in part 1, about whether the Portuguese organ gun and the Celtic woad raider would really face off, was a great example. Absolutely not. They are separated by almost 15 centuries. In the time when Celtic warriors were painting themselves blue, gunpowder itself wouldn't be invented for another millennia, let alone put in something called an organ gun. It's a little bit harder to find combinations like this because just because a certain type of unit is old doesn't mean it's limited to that time. Obviously, just because war elephants were being used in the first millennia BCE doesn't mean they weren't in continued use through the medieval period. Even in the Burmese-Siamese War that ended in 1767, the Burmese were still using war elephants. A possible example is a showdown between a Viking longship and a Korean turtle ship. First of all, there's obvious geographic separation between Korea and the areas reached by Viking explorers and settlers, unless Leif Erikson made a quick detour around South America and across the Pacific. Second of all, the Viking-style longship design was beginning to fall out of use for most of Europe in the 13th century in favor of more modern, deep-hull designs that were better for increased cargo space for trade. In Korea, the first generation of turtle ships were only being built and tested by the Joseon dynasty in the early 15th century. This means a unique naval unit contest between a longship and a turtle ship would be pitting ships separated by at least 2 centuries and thousands of miles against one another. Almost interchangeably, the Portuguese caravel only came about around 1450, making it similarly technologically advanced relative to the Viking longship. Now we'll see what kind of patterns arise when looking at unique technologies. Similarly to the unique units, we're going to start off by discussing the early unique techs. A prime example of a unique tech that I would consider pre-classical is the Aztecs' Castle Age unique tech Atlatl. An atlatl is a spear-throwing device that has been dated by some sources to as long ago as 28,000 BCE. You can see why I wouldn't put that in a 2-scale position on this graph. The second pre-classical tech is the Mongols' nomads. I mean, it's not very specific. People have been living nomadic lifestyles for thousands of years in this area of Central Asia. There isn't much to say beyond that. Getting into the pre-medieval techs, a few of these stand out. The Lithuanians and Magyars have the tower shield and recurve bow techs, respectively. Both of these date back to the classical era. Interestingly, almost all of the South Asian civs also have a tech that would date to this era. Banging these all out here, Bengalis have Mahayana, which is just one of the 2 major branches of Buddhism dating back to the 1st century BCE. The Burmese have howdah, which is the word for the massive multi-person saddles that allowed people to ride on the backs of war elephants and date back to the 6th century BCE. The following civilizations, all subdivisions of the former combined Indian Civ as well, all have texts dating back to the 5th century BCE. The Dravidians have Wootz steel, a steel alloy pioneered in modern-day southern India. The Gurjaras have Kshatriya, which is the warrior caste of the Varna social class system. Finally, the Hindustanis have the Grand Trunk Road, which is an ancient land-based trade route across modern-day northern India. Next, we're going to get into our 1999 unique texts. And before I get into those, I need to acknowledge another Age of Empires channel, HHF AoE. His videos ranking the 5 least and best fitting unique texts are informative, funny, and all around excellent, and I'm going to go ahead and plagiarize a little bit of them. Once again, looking back at our 1999 texts, many of these were covered by him. The first is the Mayans' El Dorado. El Dorado is a myth spread by 16th and 18th century European explorers of a city of gold in the Amazon. This doesn't check out, as Mayans are neither European, nor from the 16th to 18th century, nor in the Amazon. The second is the Celts' Furor Celtica. I mean, it's just Latin words meaning Celtic fury. Why it gives siege units greater health is also a mystery. This is made up. Next is the Franks' Bearded Axe. This is a bit more historically nuanced. Indeed, the Franks did use throwing axes. There is also evidence from medieval times of axes being given beards, or sections stretching below where it connected to the shaft of the axe, to increase the blade length without increasing the weight as much. However, my research found this linked to Vikings more than to Frankish society. Nothing completely unfounded, but not solid. Next is the Goths' Perfusion. This is an iconic tech, especially if you love playing the Goths as much as I do. It just lets you spam the hell out of Huskarls and flood enemy towns at will. Upon researching it, perfusion turns out to be a medical term for the movement of fluid, usually blood or lymphatic fluid, through the body to an organ or tissue. Yeah, Huskarls streaming to destroy your town is compared to a stream of blood. I don't think any other tech is named this way. Very interesting. Up next, we have the Byzantines' Logistica. This gives your cataphracts trample damage against infantry. Again, this is just another Latin word, and it means logistics. Not really sure what's going on here. Keeping them coming, we have the Maghrebi camels of the Berbers. This just means camels coming from the Maghreb region of Africa, and it doesn't feel particularly grounded in any exact time. Next up is another great example from HHF AoE's video, the Ethiopians' torsion engines. This is referring to catapults using a torsion mechanism for power, but we can't find any evidence of Ethiopians using torsion siege weaponry at all in their history. Next is the Persians' Kamandaran. This supposedly refers to the military organization of the Parthian Empire, but there isn't a lot of verifiable information about it. A reasonable approach for me throughout this process was that if the Age of Empires tech is the first thing that shows up in the Google search, it's probably not a very significant historical thing, and usually is not very verifiable. The Saracens' Imperial Age unique tech is one I would put in a problematic category. The tech is called zealotry. I'm not a fan of the religious implications it has. It came with the Conqueror's expansion in 2000, and I'm sure subsequent events may have made them reconsider calling it that. Next is the Cuman's steppe husbandry. This is supposed to be referring to a domestication of horses in this area very long ago, but otherwise it's just kind of a broad idea of the people of Central Asian steppes being adept at breeding horses. Another tech with questionable history is the Tatars' silk armor. Supposedly the Mongol army wore a silk layer of clothing in battle, as when hit with an arrow, the silk would not be fully pierced, so that even if the arrow had entered the body, tugging at the silk around it would allow it to come out easily and the wound to be more treatable. This is interesting, but isn't grounded in much verifiable evidence either. The Malays' Imperial Age tech is simply called forced levy. It seems to be referring to conscription, but it's unclear what part of Southeast Asian history this is referring to. The penultimate 1999 tech is the Japanese kataparuto. It allows Japanese trebuchets to pack and unpack faster. While helpful in-game, historically medieval Japan did not have trebuchets, nor much siege weaponry at all, nor even the word itself, kataparuto. Indeed, kataparuto is just a modern Japanization of the English word catapult. History often takes a back seat to game balance. Finally, the Vietnamese have a unique tech called shatras. Shatras are ceremonial umbrellas significant to Hindu, Jain, and Buddhist traditions, but typically further east, outside of Vietnam. What this has to do with giving elephant units more HP is beyond me. Like I said, when we look back at our combined unique unit and tech graphic, we're given a pretty complicated picture. The developers seem to take different approaches to different civs, with a very concentrated, narrow historical view towards some, and very broad views towards others. Take the Bohemians. The devs were really focusing on the Bohemians' involvement in the Hussite Wars of the early 15th century. Every one of their unique units and techs concerned this period, including the Hufnitze, the Hussite wagon, Hussite reforms, and Wagenburg tactics. A civ like the Chinese, unsurprisingly, gets a much broader representation from the devs, with the unique unit of the Chukonu being separated by a millennium from the Chinese unique techs, i.e. the construction of the Great Wall and the invention of rocketry. The unique techs are really all over the place, and getting a more particular understanding of the in-game civilizations, particularly through their appearances in the in-game campaigns and historical battles, might give us a greater insight, and that will be forthcoming in a future video. But now that we have this information, let's start synthesizing the information into possible timelines for the onsets of the Castle and Imperial ages, as we set out to do. The unique units gives us a median year for the Castle Age of 1100 of the Common Era. This actually exceeds what we determined for the Imperial Age from the generic texts in Part 1. The Castle Age unique texts have a median historical year of 1203. Again, this pushes the Castle Age later than the time we determined for the Imperial Age from the generic texts as well. The Imperial Age unique texts have a median historical year of 1188. Yeah, it's actually a little bit before the Castle Age unique texts. Though the story given to us for the Castle and Imperial Ages based upon the unique units and texts disagreed with our conclusions from Part 1, we can actually argue they are more conclusive. To demonstrate this, consider these plots of all the data points we've looked at thus far across Part 1 and Part 2. Each number is a given century, with the negatives representing BCE, and each dot represents an instance of a tech or unique unit. The generic tech data is much more scant. Additionally, the Neolithic outliers that appear in the general texts, as well as the Castle Age unique texts, may significantly affect the standard deviation of their respective sets. Accordingly, because of the more consistent and precise data from the unique unit and Imperial Age unique text sets, the conclusions drawn from them might be considered more consistent, even if they place the Castle and Imperial Ages rather close together and much later than the generic tech tree did. In spite of the question marks raised here, we're well on our way to determining a timeline for Age of Empires 2 from each source of clues within the game, covering the generic tech tree and the unique units and tech so far. Our next videos will gather from additional sources, such as the appearances of civs within in-game campaigns and historical battles, as well as historical information surrounding the civilization as they existed in the real world. With those under our belt, we can perhaps ascribe a weighting for each piece that will ultimately lead to our final conclusion. Thanks for watching.